crack. You're going to come down to your windshield. You're going to make sure you have a clear visibility. There's no cracks. There's no chips out of the windshield. You're going to come to check your windshield wipers. You're going to make sure there's tension, that the rubbers are not chipped or cracked or weather worn or peeling off the wiper blade. Check them both. Make sure there's tension. Make sure your windshield wiper fluid hose lines go in. They're connected. There's no fluid coming out of them. You're going to come down and make sure there's no debris in your grill. Make sure your grill's intact. It's not rattling, shaking, or loose. You're going to come down and check your lights. Make sure your lights are intact. Make sure that the lights are clean. There's no cracks in them. Check your blinker, same way. Make sure that they're clean. They're not cracked. They're not chipped. You're going to come down and check your bumper. Make sure that bumper is intact. There's no bolts or nuts missing. And you're going to check your license plate. Make sure your license plate is fastened on. It's not loose. It's not rattling. Your oil checkers here. You're going to check and make sure you have the proper oil and the proper amount. Make sure your cap is on. Make sure everything is intact. You're going to come down to the side and do your front suspension. You're going to look at the side of the truck first. You're going to make sure your mirror mounts are intact. You're going to work your way across. Make sure your mirrors are intact. They're all loose. There's no nuts or bolts missing. They're not cracked and they are clean. You're going to come down, make sure there's no debris coming out of the side of your truck. Everything's intact. Nothing's loose. Lights are intact. You're going to come down to the front suspension part. You're going to check your pitman arm. You're going to make sure your pitman arm cotter pin is in it. The nipples are greased by the bottom of the cotter pin. You're going to check your drag link. Make sure your drag link is intact. The nipples are greased. The cotter pin is in them. Drag link's going to come down. You're going to check your steering link connects to the tie rod. You're going to check both linkage where the tie rod and the steering link is. Make sure your steering arm has its cotter pins in it. Make sure they're greased. Everything's intact. No loose bolts are missing. You're going to check your steering ring knuckle. Got to make sure your cotter pin is intact and your steering ring knuckle. Everything is greased. You're going to come down by your pitman arm. You're going to check your power steering gearbox, which connects to your pitman arm. Make sure all the hoses are hooked up. Clamps are on the hoses. There's no leaks. Everything's intact. You're going to come down to your front wheel on the inside. You're going to check your brake drum. Make sure your brake drum is not cracked. It's not loose. It's not chipped. And you're going to look in the inside. You're going to feel your brakes. You're going to make sure your brake linings are good. Make sure there's no oil. There's no grease on the linings. There's no uneven grooves where it would be wearing uneven. You're going to check your pads and linings. You're going to make sure your pads and linings are intact. They've not been heated. They're not burning. There's no grease or oil, anything on them. You're going to check your air line coming into your brakes. Make sure your air line's intact. Everything's secured. Bolts are on there. There's no air leaking. When you do your pre-trip, you have the truck running and check to make sure there's no air leaking out of it. Cotter pins are intact. Nipples are greased in oil. Everything looks secure. You're going to check your brake drum to make sure it's intact. All the bolts are on. Everything looks good. You'll come down to your axle where it goes into the tire. You're going to make sure your axle is intact. Running across. You got U-bolts going across leaf springs. Your U-bolts are intact. Your U-bolt plate is intact on the axle. All the nuts are clear. None of them are rusted. None of them are broken. Your shackles are connected to the leaf springs. You want to make sure your clips are on your shackles. None of the leaf springs are broken or cracked by the shackle. Make sure all your bolts are intact. Make sure your nipples are greased. Everything is greased. Your shackle plate, which hooks onto the frame of the truck, you want to make sure all your bolts are intact. No bolts are missing. Everything's tight. Everything's been greased. You'll check the front part. The shackle plate has one in the front also. You're going to check the same thing. Make sure all your bolts are intact. None of them are rusted, cracked, chipped, or broken. Your nipple in front is greased. Everything is greased in oil. We're going to come to the front wheel. We're going to check the tire. Make sure it's not a retread. Make sure there's no obstructions in front, as in nails or pieces of wood jammed in the tire. Everything looks okay. You're going to look at the outside. Make sure it's not weather cracked or bubbles or dents or if there's any bruises. You'll do the same thing for the inside. You'll use your tire tool, which is in here. You bang on your tire to make sure it has good solid pressure. You want to use a pressure gauge also Find out the amount of pressure when it's hot or when it's cold. Everything looks good on the tire. I'm going to come down to the rim. I'm going to check the outside of the rim. Make sure there's no dents, no cracks on the rim, no air leaking out from where the tire goes to the rim. Everything looks solid. Check your valve stem. Make sure it's not bent. Feel for any air leaking out of it. There's the cap is on. It is tight and secure. You're going to check lug nuts. Make sure all your lug nuts are intact. None of them are rusted. None of the studs are broken or loose. Everything is intact. You're going to check your spindle. Make sure your cover's on it. You're going to check to make sure your grease inside is at the proper amount. And there's no leaks coming out. Your seal is nice and tight. No oil or grease running along the edge. Nothing's cracked. None of the bolts are rusted. You want to make sure there's no welds on the inside or outside, like the wheel had been broken and refixed. And on your tire tread, you're going to make sure it's 4 30-seconds in the front tire. They're not retreads or anything, and you're going to have 2 30-seconds in the rear.
Minimum.
Everything looks intact. Now we're going to go to the engine compartment. Let me take a break. See what we're going to do the engine compartment. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to check it. You can't lift the cab on the test, but what you do is you lift your cab. You're going to check the radiator. You're going to check the top of the radiator, make sure there's no cracks, no busted welds, make sure there's no foreign debris sticking into the top of the radiator or into the front or back of it. You're going to go down to the bottom. You're going to check the bottom underneath, make sure no welds or nothing's cracked or nothing's broken underneath the radiator. You're going to check your fluid level at the top in your reservoir. Make sure it's at the proper amount and there's no debris, no chunks of anything floating inside the top of your radiator. You're going to come down to the bottom of the radiator. You're going to check your radiator hose coming in through the bottom that connects to the engine. You're going to check to make sure that the clamps are on tight, they're sealed. There's no debris around the clamps. There's no rust on the clamps. There's no foreign objects or anything that are kinking the hose, making the hose bent where water's not going to get through. And you're going to go to the top. You're going to check the same hose at the top. It's going to have a clamp on it. You want to make sure the clamp's not broken, it's not chipped, it's tightened down, it's fastened. The hose isn't soft, it's firmly secure, it's not kinked, there's no cuts or tears in it or any liquid leaking out of it. You're going to come down to the fan. You're going to check the fan blades. You're going to make sure all the blades are intact. None of the blades are chipped, none of the blades are busted. The fan's going to hook in. You're going to make sure the nut's in front of the fan. Make sure the fan is tight. The nut is fastened down and secure. Then you're going to come to the water pump. You're going to check your water pump. You're going to go all along the seal. Make sure you feel for no water. Make sure the seal is intact. All the bolts are mounted into the water pump, into the engine, and that it is working properly. You're going to check your belts. Your drive belt, your power steering belt, your air conditioner belt. You're going to make sure that there's no 3/4 of an inch play on it. You're going to make sure they're not cracked, they're not chipped, they're not worn, they're not wearing uneven. As your system goes down, you're going to check your air conditioner bracket. You're going to make sure your air conditioner bracket is intact. The pulley system is tightened down. There's no nuts or bolts rusted, or none of them are missing. You're going to check your alternator, which is hooked onto your belts. You're going to check your alternator and make sure the positive wire is flush into the alternator. There's no loose frayed wires or anything. Make sure your negative wire is ground. You're going to come down to the top to your drive port. You're going to make sure the drive system is intact. There's no looseness. There's 2 pulley systems up there. Make sure the pulleys aren't loose. There's no play in any of the pulleys. They're bolted down and they're fastened. You're going to come up to the top of the engine. You're going to check your head. Make sure your head gasket's intact. There's no oil leaking out of the engine block onto the engine. You're going to check your exhaust manifold, which is at the top of the engine on the other side of the head. You're going to make sure your exhaust manifold is not cracked. There's no chips in it. It's not rusting. There's no bolts busted off or nuts missing. You're going to check your breather sitting on top of your head. Your breather you're going to check for, make sure your air cleaner is clean. You have a little tester that you can check. Make sure it's not over the danger line. Make sure the tester is secure and all the breather hoses and lines going in the turbo are intact. You're going to come down to your power steering pump. You're going to make sure your power steering reservoir. You're going to make sure your power steering reservoir is intact. The bracket that hooks onto the engine is intact. None of the bolts are missing. It has a proper fluid level. You're going to check your starter, which is on this side. You're going to check your starter to make sure your solenoid is intact. Your starter is not loose or shaken. The positive wire going in the solenoid is bolted down and fastened. The negative ground wire is bolted down and fastened. You're going to check. No, it's kind of working my way down the engine. I'm going to get to the air lines that are running into the cab. They're about engine block height. I'm going to make sure the secondary and the emergency lines are intact. They're all fastened down. There's no air leaking coming out of the lines. All the lines are secured. They got their clips on. They're bolted and fastened. The clips are bolted and fastened to the frame. Make sure that there's no loose air lines or anything kinked out. They can get heated, they can get bent, they can have a moving part get into the airline. The airline comes down to the air tank and compressor, the first air tank and compressor that's underneath. You're going to check to make sure all the air lines go into the compressor. Make sure nothing's loose, none of the air lines are chipped or cracked. Make sure they're all solid and clean. There's no air leaking out of them. There's no oil or grease leaking out. You're going to come down to your oil pan. You're going to check your oil pan. You're going to make sure your oil pan is fastened up. The gasket is not leaking. There are no seals leaking out of your oil pan. You have a fuel filter here. You're going to check your fuel filter. You're going to make sure your fuel filter is fastened on. It's tight. It's not loose. It's not wobbling. There's no fuel leaking out of it. As you come down, you're going to come to your oil plug at the bottom of the pan. You want to make sure that it's fastened down. It's nice and tight. The plug's not loose. There's no oil or anything dripping out of the plug. We're going to pause it. We're going to go. Okay, I'm underneath the truck on this side. I'm just checking the 3 oil filters that are on this side. I want to make sure they're all intact. There's no oil, there's no debris leaking out of them. I want to make sure that they're not cracked or dented or gouged or any other particles are in it. While I'm over here, I'm also going to check the sway bar. I'm going to make sure the sway bar is intact, everything is secure. All 3 filters look good. There's a fuel filter. I'm going to check that one over here, make sure it is intact, everything is secure. All the hoses coming down, the fuel lines coming into the filters and everything. The clamps are on them. There's no kinks in them. They are fast and tight. They're not near their exhaust. There's no loose wires or anything rubbing around the fuel system. Okay, I'm going to check on this side. I'm going to check to make sure the transmission is bolted up to the engine. I'm going to make sure all the seals are tight. There's no grease or oil along the seals. There's no bolts or anything missing on it. Everything looks intact. There's no oil or anything running along the bottom. The plate is intact. As I'm back to this side, I'm checking the transmission on this side, making sure the seals are intact. The fuel filter, which is sitting right by the transmission, there's no loose items on it. Nothing's rubbing against it. Everything is intact. Make sure no fuel is leaking out onto the electrical lines. They go in right by the engine. Electrical lines are all fastened. They're not frayed. Everything is secure. There's no mobility out of them, so they can't rub against anything. I'm going to check the transmission seals. Make sure the transmission seals are intact. There's no leaks coming out of the transmission or anything. There's no oil or grease buildup on the bottom. I have an air tank right here. I'm going to check my air tanks. Air lines going into the air tanks are secured. There's no air leaking out of them. They're not rusted. None of the bolts are missing out of them. I'm going to make sure they're fastened onto the brackets. Make sure everything's intact onto the brackets. There's no debris. There's no cracks or welds or busted onto the brackets at all. Everything looks intact. I have an air valve drain that I can check. I'll pull on the air valve drain to get any water, any oil, any kind of liquid to come out of the air tanks to make sure that's not circulating to keep my air lines clean. As my air lines run back out of the air tanks, back to the coupling system, all the air lines are intact. They are fastened down, they're wrapped, they're nice and tight. There's no loose items that can hit it, no moving items that can hit them and rub against them. And everything looks secure and bolted down. Okay, before I go back any further, system. Here we're going to do the engine start and the pre-trip inspection into the cab. First thing you do before you start your engine, you're going to put your seatbelt on. Make sure your seatbelt is locked and secure. Make sure your handle on your seat is tightened. Adjust it to the amount that you want. Once it's locked, make sure it is secure. You have an air line in there. You'll check that when it's running. You'll make sure when you're doing your pre-trip, you got the keys in your pocket at all the time so no one can hop in the truck and move the truck. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put the key in the ignition. Push the clutch in, make sure it's out of gear, turn it, we're going to get a start. I'm going to watch my primary and my secondary air lines. I'm going to make sure they adjust to the proper pressure between 100 and 120. Everything's looking good. I'm going to come around and check my water temperature, make sure it is at the proper running condition. I'm going to make sure my oil pressure is proper. I'm going to make sure my RPMs, it is idling properly. I'm going to come around to my voltmeter, make sure my batteries are charged, everything looks good. There is fuel tank in the fuel system. Everything looks go. Okay, I'm going to go around, check my air lines, make sure they are pushed in, and make sure they are pulled out. Once it gets to the proper air, I'm going to make sure they will push in. Everything looks secure. The they're not broken. I'm going to come down to my panel lights. I'm going to turn my panel lights on, make sure all my panel lights are working. There's no bulbs out. If there is, I'll have to check them. I'm going to check my lights. We're going to do the pre-trip on the lights now. I'm going to have Steve outside. I got my headlights on. Okay, I'm going to hit my brights. When you hit your brights, you're going to make sure that your bulb comes on also in the truck. I'm going to do my left turn signal. Everything is flashing. It is flashing on the dashboard too. My right turn signal. Everything is flashing. Looks good on the flash. I'm going to do my hazards. Hazards are on. Both are blinking onto the panel. Okay, we go around to the back and check the back now. We're going to keep hazards first. Hazards will stay on. We'll check the back. Okay, hazards got an okay. I'm going to turn it. Left blinker. Everything's okay. Panel light works. Right. Okay. Brake lights. Push in my brakes. Hey, everything works good. Then you're going to come down and check your clutch. It's checked. We'll get my clearance lights checked also. Everything look good? It's going to be hard to tell out in the daylight. But he gives me the green light, everything is okay. First thing you're going to do, you're going to check your clutch. Make sure there's no play. When you take your clutch out, you're going to listen to that engine. Make sure there's no unusual noises. You don't hear no air leaks coming out. You're going to check your brake pedal. Make sure it does push down. And there's no obstructions, no debris stopping it. The pedal is nice and firm. You're going to check your gas pedal. Make sure it is not sticking. It's revving up correctly at the right RPMs. Everything looks good and intact. I'm going to come around and check my windshield wipers. Make sure my windshield wipers work. Okay, everything looks good. You're going to look on your windshield, make sure there's no crack, there's no oil or grease, anything to obstruct your vision. You're going to look the same way in your mirrors also. Make sure there's no cracks on your mirrors are fastened, there's no obstruction of your vision, you can see. You're going to come around and you're going to check to make sure your heater works. Make sure your defroster works, blower works, everything turns on, everything looks good. Okay? You're going to check to make sure your fire extinguisher is mounted. It is right there, it is mounted. I have a first aid kit and triangles in the side compartment for my pre-trip. Everything is fastened down and secure. I opened up my dash. I have emergency phone list with emergency numbers on it. I have my fuses and an extra ball. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my truck off. I'm going to leave my key on though. I'm going to check to make sure that my warning lights go on when I do my brakes. Make sure when the air pressure does go low, the warning lights are coming on properly. That's the oil. Here comes the air light. Warning light is on for the air. Everything looks good. I'm going to start it back up, let the air pressure build back up. Once the siren goes off, the air pressure will be building back up. You want to make sure it builds out 2 pounds per minute. Everything's looking good. It's building up. Give it a little gas so we can get it going a little quicker. Okay, it's building up to the proper weight. Once it gets proper, what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave my trailer brake on. I'm going to push in my parking brake. I'm going to put it in gear and make sure it drags the trailer. If the trailer is rolling, then obviously the trailer brakes aren't working properly. So go ahead and push it in, put it in gear, do a slight pull. The trailer is locked, everything looks good. Push the trailer in. I'm going to check the parking brake for the truck. Make sure it is on. Make sure the truck will not move. The parking brake is on, everything looks good. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and shut my engine off. Whenever you shut your engine off, you always want to make sure you do take the key with you. Make sure your brakes are on. And when you get it, what I'm going to do, I still have air in there. I'm going to check my horn. Horn works. You do have a little horn also on the steering wheel. Make sure the horn works. And that's it for the cab. Before I exit my truck, I'm going to check another thing. I'm going to make sure my windows are intact. I'm going to check to make sure my door does not open. Unlock the door. Make sure the handle is not broken. Close the handle. You got to make sure your windows are rolled down. Windows roll down. Everything is secure. There's no loose articles of debris, anything flapping along the side. There is an interior light. I might as well check it to make sure it works and is okay. Everything is on. There we go. Look at that. And that's it. We're going to go outside and do the coupling system. You would show the DOT instructor, you pull your cab. You always want to make sure you have them. My triangles are in there. My first aid kit is in there. My tire bar is in there. And I have my chains in there also. But you can keep that fastened in. You don't have to put it behind the seat. Make sure your latch closes back up and it's secure. Got the keys. Always keep the keys in your pocket so no one can hop in your truck and move it while you're doing your test or while you're doing your own freight trip. The next thing we're going to work on is the coupling system. And the coupling system, you want to hop up, check, make sure, this will be your electrical line, make sure it's plugged in, it's fastened. You'll pull it out. Make sure there's no oil, dirt, or grease or anything that could tamper with your lights. Make sure there's no corrosion on it. Fasten it back down. You're going to come down to the other part. You're going to check that. Make sure it's fastened in tight. It can't fall. It can't swing. There's no kinks in it. Nothing to cut it. It's fastened down and tight. You want to clean that side also. You got your emergency line, which comes in. You hook it up to your coupler system. You want to make sure there's no air or anything leaking out of it. Feel for it. You'll take the coupling system off. You want to check it to make sure that there's no debris. Your seal's not worn, weather worn, cracked, or there's no dirt or grease or anything. You always want to keep those clean so they won't clog your air lines. You check your secondary the same way. You make sure your seal is intact, everything's secured. There's no air leaks or anything leaking out of it. Everything is fully intact. I'm going to come down and as I'm over here, while I'm up, I'm going to check my exhaust as it goes down. We already checked your exhaust going inside by the manifold. You want to make sure all your clamps are on there. There's no exhaust leaks. There's no cuts or rust in it. Anything's falling out of your exhaust. And make sure it is bracketed on to its brackets. All the nuts and bolts are on it. Your guard plate is on there. Everything is intact. Nothing's going to shake or rattle that has potential of falling off. Everything looks good. Hop down off this. Okay, I'm going to come down to the inside here. As you got the fuel lines coming out, you're going to check the top of your fuel tank. Make sure your cap's on tight. You're going to check the fuel lines, make sure they're not leaking. As your fuel lines run in here, you're going to make sure there's no electrical wires that are loose or frayed or anything that has a chance to come across and spark a fire. As your air lines are coming across here, you're going to check your air lines, make sure they're fastened down, everything's tight, everything's intact, there's no air leaking out of them. You're going to check your linkage, make sure your linkage is intact to your drive shaft, make sure your nipples are greased, everything is intact. You have your air testers here. Make sure you clean your air lines to the top. As your wires and air lines run down your frame, you want to make sure they're all tightly clipped and fastened. They're not loose. No debris can kink them or cut them. There's no loose wires, no loose mechanisms. I'm going to come around to my fuel tank. I want to check my fuel tank, both sides. You want to check to make sure there's no rust, there's no dents or cracks, any loose fuel floating on the bottom, anything leaking. You're going to check your harness straps. Make sure your harness straps are on. Bolts are intact. No loose bolts. Straps aren't busted or rusting or gouging into the frame. Come around and make sure your tank holders are fastened down. They're nice and bolted, nice and tight. No loose bolts or anything. Tank looks good. I'm going to check my cab. Make sure my cab is locked down. It is secure. Make sure on this side you got the hydraulic pump. You want to make sure there's no hydraulic fluid or anything leaking out of your pump. Your pump is fastened, it's tight. You have a handle right there with the pull switch. You want to make sure it's buckled down and connected underneath and holding it nice and tight. You're going to come down to the suspension on this part right here. You're going to have your leaf springs. You're going to make sure your leaf springs aren't cracked, busted, or broken. There's no rust there. Make sure all the bolts are intact. Make sure your shackle coming up to your frame is intact. Make sure your plate has all of its bolts on. Make sure none of the bolts are rusted or loose. You're going to come down to the front of your cab as you're coming down. You're going to make sure all the clearance lights are on. There's no debris. None of the lights are busted. There's no debris. There's no tears on your body in the front. Everything looks intact and nice and solid. You're going to come down underneath And you're going to check your brakes on your tire. You're going to check your air lines going in. Make sure your air lines are intact. You're going to check your upper and lower bellows where your air line's going to go and run by. Make sure those are intact. They're not cut. Your air sack's not cut. Nothing's broken or loose on it. You have your shock. You're going to test your shock. Make sure that it's a hydraulic shock. Make sure there's no oil or grease flowing out of it. Everything's intact. Make sure your plates going onto your frame of your shock is intact. Nothing's loose or shaken. No bolts or nuts are missing. You're going to come down to your axle. You're going to make sure your axle plate on your U-bolt is intact. All your U-bolts are clamped down to the axle. Everything is secure. None of the bolts are rusted. None of the bolts are missing. Your brakes are fastened down to the hub of the wheel. Make sure all the bolts are intact. Nothing's loose. Nothing's broken. You got your airline coming in. Make sure your airline clamps are on. The airline is not loose. Make sure none of the bolts are leaking out air. All the bolts are on. Make sure they're not rusted or cracked or anything's loose on it. You're going to check your drag link. You're going to make sure your drag link has less than 1 inch. If it has more than 1 inch, you're going to have it looked at and have it serviced. And you come to this side of the suspension. Check your other shackle and your plate. Make sure it's intact. Everything is secure. Nothing's loose on it. Your shackle's down at the bottom. All the bolts are intact. Nothing's loose on it. You're going to check your tread before I get to the fifth wheel. You're going to check the wheel. Make sure your tires match, same match, no mismatched tires, like a radial and a ply tire. Make sure you got at least 2 30-seconds of a tread. No nails, no debris inside. You're going to look through. Make sure there's no air or no gap between your hubs on your dualies. Make sure there's no foreign objects. Your wheels haven't been rusted. None of them are chipped or dented or gouged. Your valve stems are not leaking air on both of them. I'm going to make sure they're intact. There's no air leaking out of them. You're going to check your outside hub. Make sure there's no rust, no welds, no oil or anything or grease on them. Make sure your nuts are fastened. No nuts are rusted or loose. None of them are cracked. None of your studs have been broken or broken off. Check your hub. Make sure it has a proper grease inside. You can check your nuts. Make sure the nuts are intact. None of the studs are broken off. Everything looks good. Seal has not been busted. On the inside of your brakes, you're going to go ahead and check the inside of the brakes. You're going to feel for any uneven grooves, any oil, any grease, anything that's going to make it look like the brakes have been overheating. You check your linings and your pads the same way. Make sure they have proper thickness. There's no burn marks on them. There's no uneven wearing or uneven grooves. Everything looks intact. They're not loose. They're not rattling. You're going to go down and check your axle as it hooks up. Make sure your axle is intact. There's no cracks, no welds are broken, no loose items. As it comes into your rear end, you're going to check your rear end seal. Make sure all the bolts are in. None of them are busted off, none of the studs, none of them are loose. You come down to the back side of the axle, you're going to check the same thing. Come down underneath. There's no oil or grease leaking out. Nipples on the drive shaft above the axle have been greased. The drive shaft linkage is correct. It's not loose. Make sure there's no play, there's no shake in it. You're going to come down to your fifth wheel. Underneath your body, you want to look where the fifth wheel connects. Make sure the frame's not teared, none of the welds are broken or anything. You want to make sure you cannot see no air between your fifth wheel. Make sure it's properly greased. Your upper fifth wheel is properly greased. Make sure your lower fifth wheel is connected to the shank. There's no debris or anything